US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin has promised the US will continue to support Ukraine, even as more aid for Kyiv remains stalled in Congress. Speaking at a meeting of Ukraine's allies in Germany, Austin warned that Russia's President Vladimir Putin would not, quote, stop at Ukraine.
Russia has squandered.
Now, Ukraine is preparing for renewed Russian assaults along its front line. That is according to a report from the UK's Defence Ministry. Fortifications likely include anti-tank obstacles, trenches and minefields. The report says Ukraine's stalled counter-offensive last year has forced its military onto a more defensive footing. Kupiansk in the Kharkiv region was occupied in the first days of the full-scale invasion, but it was then recaptured by Ukrainian forces after almost 6 months. Frank Ledwidge is a former military officer and a senior lecturer in war studies at Portsmouth University in the UK, and he joins us now. Good to see you, Frank. Can you tell us what it would mean if Kupiansk is retaken by the Russians?
Good afternoon, Anya. Kupiansk is a linchpin, essentially. What isn't immediately apparent on the report, or indeed on the map, if you look at it first, is that Kupiansk sits on a river, which is quite a considerable obstacle, but it also acts as a crossroads for road and rail links. In terms of logistics, it's a hub, obviously. It's a very important, like I said, it's a crossroads, but there's also about 2.5 hours tank drive, if I can put it like that, from Kharkiv, in whose oblast it sits. So it's a linchpin. To the south is Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, to the north the Russian border. But it's a very important potential fortress for the Ukrainians. It'll take some taking.
So how has Ukraine's army been preparing to fend off this Russian advance?
As you heard on the report there, the city was taken before, right early on in the invasion. In fact, it was betrayed by some traitors, despite its will, I think, to fight for a bit, and then retaken in that great Kharkiv counteroffensive in late 22. So there's no doubt, and of course it held throughout the 7 years war before that. So there's no doubt at all the Ukrainians, I think, could be prepared physically to defend it, and it's fortified. It's also going to be very well manned, I think, and as you can see from the report, the Ukrainians are planning for this and they're seeing this coming.
After his election victory, Russia's President Vladimir Putin talked about creating a buffer zone on Ukrainian territory. Can you tell us more about that? What would that potentially look like?
Yeah, immediately that's connected with these incursions by depending on how you look at it, renegade or traitorous Russian forces or liberating Russian dissidents. But that's a pretext, really. So, yes, the idea is there would be what you might call a cordon sanitaire within Ukrainian territory. That's what Putin says. And that would mean that they would have to take a great deal more territory on that eastern front, including bits very close to Kharkiv, if not Kharkiv itself. So it's a tall order for them. They won't be doing that for a long time, if at all. But the idea is to create essentially a cordon sanitaire, a term also we've used, by the way, of course, in Gaza, perhaps not so much recently.
Mm-hmm. OK. And moving forward, what is Ukraine's likely strategy looking like?
Well, Anya, there again, as hinted in the report, they are building and have been building since November defensive lines. They're taking a slightly different approach than the Russians. Theirs was a very old-fashioned sort of linear approach. What the Ukrainians seem to be doing, they're building several lines like the Russians did in the Surovikin lines, but they're focusing much more on strong points, on control points, a lot more like, if we want to get into the history of it, late First World War defences, which are like to be highly effective. The trouble is, of course, they only started a few months ago, and they don't necessarily have the manpower in terms of military manpower, or the setup, as the Russians did, in terms of army-level engineering to do it perhaps as comprehensively as the Russians did. I've no doubt, however, that they will be effective. And the likely approach will probably be, and it won't look good this if it happens, is that the Ukrainians will be holding off the Russians as they are now, even though the Russians are making incremental advances, and eventually they will withdraw to the first lines and then rely on the attritional power that's inherent in that to keep the Russians off. That would be in the medium term. The real challenge, though, for the Ukrainians, though, apart from equipment, is manpower. And that's going to be a problem for the rest of this year, I think.
Frank, we'll have to leave it there, but thanks so much as ever. That's military analyst Frank Ledwidge.
Thank you, Anya.
And for more, I'm joined here in the studio by DW's Eastern Europe editor, Roman Goncharenko. Hi, Roman. What would it mean if Kupiansk is retaken?
Well, there are two reasons why Kupiansk is important. First one, militarily, and if we look at the map, it's a town very close to the Russian border, about 40 kilometers. And it's second most important railway hub in the Kharkiv region. So if Russia retakes it, it will be able to transport more of its troops by the railway, which will enable it to continue moving further west towards the city of Kharkiv, which was not taken by Russian troops during the invasion 2 years ago, but they came very close. So they were on the outskirts, and they will certainly try to do it again. And taking Kupiansk would mean that the Russians will move further and endanger other towns which were liberated by the Ukrainian army in the fall of 2022. And this is a psychological blow for the Ukrainian army because the Kharkiv operation, as they call it, is considered to be one of the most successful in the history of this war because it was very fast and Ukrainians were able to liberate almost the whole region occupied by Russia.
Okay. Now, we know that Russia has just appointed a new Navy chief. Can you tell us why was the last commander-in-chief sacked? And how significant is this new appointment?
Well, it is an important appointment because there is no official explanation, of course, but it is obvious. Ukrainian army was able to destroy a lot of Russian military vessels in the Black Sea. So the famous Russian Black Sea fleet was really weakened. According to the Ukrainian sources, more than 20 vessels were destroyed since the Russian invasion. The last one just about 2 weeks ago in early March. So Ukraine is using its own missiles, Western precise missiles, and it's also using its own newly developed sea drones. And they are extremely successful. And some experts I've been talking to, military experts in the West, say that the whole situation in the Black Sea is a huge success for the Ukrainian army. So the Ukrainians suffering losses on the front, on the land, mainland, but at sea the situation is different. So we've seen also reports that the Russians are trying to put additional weapon systems on their ships to protect them from the Ukrainian sea drones, but it is not clear if they are successful. At the moment, Ukrainian has the upper hand in the Black Sea. This is the picture.
Defence leaders from around Europe, from around the world, are meeting at the Ramstein Air Base here in Germany today to coordinate support for Ukraine. We're going to take a quick listen to the US Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin because he has promised that the United States, again, will not let Ukraine fail. Let's take a listen to what he said.
Ukraine's struggle for freedom matters to us all. And ladies and gentlemen, let's not kid ourselves. Putin will not stop at Ukraine. But as President Biden has said, Ukraine can stop Putin if we stand with Ukraine and provide the weapons that it needs to defend itself. Ukraine's survival is on the line, and all of our security is on the line.
Roman, what can we expect to come out of that meeting in Ramstein today?
Well, the most important thing for Ukraine is more artillery shells, because since the United States is not delivering as it used to, Ukraine is suffering of shell shortage. So basically, Ukraine lacks everything, but especially artillery shells. We are hearing reports that some Ukrainian soldiers can only fire 4 to 5 times a day. Before, just a few months ago, they could fire 40 to 50 shots a day. That's a huge difference. So the Russian army has no shortage at all, and that is why it is gaining ground. And so the most important for Ukraine is now a promise of more artillery shells, but basically Ukraine also needs missiles, it needs armored vehicles. The United States has delivered or promised to deliver weapons for about $300 million US dollars. But this will only last, we are told, maybe 1 or 2 weeks. If Ukraine ration it, it will maybe last 3 or 4 weeks, but that's it. But the war is intensifying. The spring and summer campaign will be intensifying. Russia is preparing a new offensive on several fronts. So it is a very, very dire situation for Ukraine. That's why Ramstein is so important.
DW's Roman Goncharenko. Thanks so much, Roman.